What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking E Forge, and today I'm going to show you how I turned a railroad spike like this into a barbecue fork that looks like this. Let's get rocking. All right, so what I got going on here so far is I'm necking down, I'm leaving a spot that's going to become the tines of the fork, and then I am slowly tapering the actual shank of the railroad spike down. And I'm gonna taper that all the way up to the head of the spike, make the handle a little bit thinner, and then I'm gonna taper that all the way down and then probably either round it out or do a twist with it or something like that. So next step I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna keep the head kind of the way it is right now. I kind of started in a similar way to the way I start my leaves, isolating a little bit off the end here. Once I get the handle to the final dimension and taper that I want, I'm gonna flatten this isolated piece down and then chisel it in half and forge those into the tines. So let's keep on rocking. This is why I don't like these tongs. Go check out my Amazon tongs video if you want to see more details. These things loosen up like crazy. All right, so I'm trying to get the shank portion of this fork down to about a 1/4 inch square, all the way up to the handle. I'm gonna have a bit of a transition between the handle and the actual shank. I'm at about 1/2 inch square here, 3/8 inch here, and just a little over a 1/4 inch there, and I'm sitting about a 1/4 inch square down right next to the head of this thing. So we're gonna keep drawing that up till, I don't know, till I feel like it, but effectively around here. And then I'm gonna grab this with a different pair of tongs the other way and thin down the handle before I do anything with it. And this is gonna look short because I'm gonna come in and thin this down a little bit, and that's gonna extend this quite a bit. But I want up to this transition to be about a 1/4 inch. All right, so now I'm just gonna planish this off a little bit, kind of smooth everything out. I'm gonna come back and round this up later, and I'm gonna get a little bit of extra length out of that even then. But we're gonna spin this around and start working on the handle. All right, so now I'm just kind of working things in here on the final portions of the handle here. I kind of like the taper I've got. It ain't perfect, I got a little fiddling to do with it. But I did notice that this head is pretty worse for wear, so I just wanted to kind of doctor up some of the corners here. kind of trying to clean up that inside corner in there. All in all, this is meant to be rough, so I'm gonna leave it pretty well the way it is, but figured I'd doctor up some of the rougher spots on it. Alrighty, so we've got this thing down to where I want it. Got an okay taper here for the handle, nice roughly 1/4 inch shank. So now it is time to flip this around and we're gonna start working on the actual fork tines. First thing we're gonna do here is we're going to flatten this out and kind of shape that down, and then in preparation for chiseling this in half and splitting it, and then we'll go ahead and split that down the middle and forge each tine out before I kind of do all of the finishing touches, rounding off all the corners or twisting or whatever I end up deciding to do here. So let's get rolling. Just gonna knock this kind of corner off so I don't get any kind of cold shut here. And I'm just gonna start kind of flattening things down until it reaches roughly the same thickness here as the shank. And we'll go ahead and control how much that spreads as we go. Just gonna take this slow. Now typically I like to do a taper to a point before I actually make the tines of a fork. I'm gonna try this a different way, i.e. leaving it kind of this shovel tip, so to speak, just to kind of see how it goes. We'll see how this turns out. Now it's notable here, I'm getting a little extra spreading on the face that I've been striking as opposed to the face that's been contacting the anvil. So when I take it out on the next heat, I'm gonna bring this back to strike on the back face here of that so that I get a little extra spreading on this side. All right, I am gonna do some filing there on that little transition because you can see I still have a little bit of an edge that developed. Not quite a cold shut, but I'm gonna file it out just to be safe before I finish flattening this out. All right, so now that I've got this flattened down to pretty much the same thickness as the shank, I'm just gonna do some initial shaping of the little spatula thing that we've got here before we do some chiseling. I just want it to be as symmetrical as possible before chiseling so that we can get as much mass on either side of the cut as is possible, just by eyeballing it. All right, so that I think is going to be good. This is a lot of mass up here, and that's fine. We're just gonna have some pretty thick fork tongs, and that's kind of what I'm looking for here. Next step here is going to be splitting this down the middle and then forging each tine of the fork, and then we'll get to finishing this up. Rough. All right, I'm gonna try to correct this. I ended up a little off center. Ooh, my hands are not used to working this long. It's been too long since I was in the shop. So I'm gonna try to correct this by striking at an angle here. And striking it at the opposite angle further up what's going to become the shanks. Now I think I ended up chiseling further back than I'd care to. I'm just gonna end up correcting that by not chiseling all the way through where I want it, and then I'll doctor that up with a file at the transition. So we've got that partially split already. I'm gonna heat this up, and then I'm just gonna bring this right here to the anvil and split that there. Mostly because I don't have my post vise set up yet, because I am fresh to this new shop if you haven't seen my previous videos. So we're gonna bring this back and split down the middle there, and then we'll start working on the tines. All right, we're gonna keep cutting here because I'm not fully down on the backside there, and I want to get down to where I can split the tines fully. I might come to one of these edges. In fact, I think I'm going to come to the edge of the anvil here, and I'm gonna just hammer down on the head here to split those tines apart and further define that corner and split that up. Yep, I was trying to avoid. All right, so as you can see, that's not working out super great. I don't have a hot cut handy, unfortunately, and my post vise is currently not mounted. So I'm going to go ahead and mount my post vise to my workbench so I can hopefully lock this in the vise and chisel down and then set that corner a little better than hopefully trying to split it like this and possibly messing it up. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll get back to it here in just a second. All right, so now that I have this mounted to the actual workbench, I now have to address the issue of this bracket being so high up the stationary arm of the vise that the shim does not fit through the slot required to keep the thing at least a bit more stationary. So in order to address that, I'm going to be forging my own shim out of this piece of 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch flat stock, and we're gonna get that stuck in there so that this thing doesn't wobble all over the place. See how easy this is without bending it just the hard part. So I'm trying to thicken up this portion, and this might prove more challenging than it's worth. Or I'm gonna cut this down and then upset. Might be the easiest way to go. What I did there was cool the end here so that it didn't deform, so that I could concentrate the blow where all the heat was. But because this is so long, it mostly just wants to bend, which is unfortunate. Because I want this wider laterally in order to fit that slot a little better. You can maybe tell it's thicker here than it is here, and that's because of the forging down along this axis widens things out along that axis. But unfortunately, I want to keep this as wide as it is, but I still need it thicker. So I'm gonna try my darndest to upset that back into this area here to try to get some more mass there in order to accomplish that. Now the balance here is going to be leaving enough material to actually upset back into the zone that I want it to be. While removing enough that it doesn't want to bend. Just gonna take the rest of this. Crack it off. Call it good. Ooh. Unless I miss. Do a quick little straightening here. All right, so I'm definitely getting some thickness out of it. Slow going, but the technique that I just showed is that I'm hitting down on the cold end so that I don't get as much spreading on the cold end here, while I leave the hot end contacting the anvil and then lifting in order to keep as much of the heat in the piece as possible between strikes, which is why I'm bouncing like that. So the more heat you keep in the piece, the longer you can upset it. I'm gonna check and see if this fits in the slot here. All right, I think I'm close in here. Just gonna straighten this stuff out. We're gonna go see how it fits. Okay, I actually need to thin down this direction, which will make it thicker, which will take up more space. So that's good. Maybe a heat or two left. All right, so I've nearly got the thicker or wider end of this thing worked down to a square at this point, but it also occurred to me, as I was looking at this, that this is designed to come in on this side. I still got a little bit of wiggle here, so we're gonna do another heat there, but we should be pretty darn close. Now the point in this shim, this bracket rests around the actual upright portion of the vise. This shim goes through this hole and is meant to take up all of that play. Now granted, my workbench still has quite a bit of movement in it, so this is only gonna do so much, but there's still weirdly quite a lot of wiggle. And that to me means, yeah, that is, as you can see on these scratch marks and scuff marks, that is not quite down to the right size there. But I'm gonna say, compared to that, I should have sufficient holding power to finish out my project here for the time being. So I'm gonna hammer this back in. And we'll get back to the actual project at hand. Alrighty, back to the tines on this thing. Just gonna go ahead and lock it here in the vise. Chisel down here. Okay, and now I've got a rounded side of my chisel that I'm going to use to kind of round out the space between my tines here. We're gonna go straighten that out. I don't know how it ended up bending down there, but that's a problem. Actually, before I straighten anything out, I'm gonna do some filing because there is a lot of roughness here on the shank, and I don't want that to end up causing a cold shut or a crack. So I'm gonna do some filing. Now I'm doing this hot because this should allow the file to take off more material with every stroke and be a lot more efficient use of my time. Or I can do things the easy way, the fast way, and take things off much quicker. However, I do tend to still like to do the traditional way of doing things, and you can get a lot deeper into the nooks and crannies with a good bastard file or a different shaped file. And I kind of like to do it both ways, with the file or with the grinder, just to kind of show both ways. But if you don't have a grinder, a file works absolutely fine. Now the reason I'm continuing to split this is because I want these to be roughly the same thickness as the shank, so that it comes up and it just splits into tines either direction, and that they're all pretty relatively the same thickness. So I'm going to take a couple of heats. Biggest thing here is not heating up this portion of the shank anymore, because it's so thin at this point that any bending force is going to bend it before you bend any of the thicker pieces. But I will eventually need to get the tines of the fork pretty well perpendicular to the actual shank itself in order to work on them with the hammer. So that's going to be a challenge we're going to have to tackle, but we're going to get into that right now. We go a little bit farther. So as you can see, even that little bit of chiseling bent this portion of the shank over just slightly, which is not ideal. This is as far as I'm going to take this. I'm going to start dressing this up and thinning these things down using files and my grinder, just to avoid overstressing this little segment here, because it is the thinnest portion both horizontally and vertically on this piece, and the last thing I want to do is this to wiggle around and have the whole head of the fork fall off. So in order to tackle that, I'm just going to be using my files to dress up the teeth marks, so to speak, from the jaws of the vise, and I'm going to be thinning down the tines of the fork using primarily files and the grinder, and then we'll show a little bit of forging them to final dimension before we finish this up. So wish me luck. Now I've got to dress up that side too. All right, so I have defaulted to locking this poor thing in the vise here. And I've lost most of my heat already, but I'm just gonna try to beat this thing down into submission using that fuller you just saw. This is proving more difficult than I anticipated. All right, I finally managed to get the tines kind of where I wanted them. And I'm just gonna really slowly work these in. As you can tell, they're still pretty misformed and misshapen. But we're just gonna slowly work these in, one heat at a time. What I'm trying to avoid, again, is any extra wiggling of this transition between the shank and the actual tines of the fork itself, because wiggling back and forth and any stress concentrators, i.e. rough patches or cracks that have already developed in there, are going to grow a crack and then cause the whole thing to fail and break off right there at the head of the fork, so to speak. So we're just going to take this nice and slow and slowly thin these tines out, one heat at a time. I'm just working nice and slow, focusing my blows where I think they're needed without stressing that main transition I talked about earlier. Now, you can probably tell This tine is considerably longer than that one, and I think that goes back to the way I split it, misalignment in splitting, or loss of material on one more than the other as I was grinding or filing. And all in all, that's not gonna be a huge deal. We're gonna end up grinding those down to the same length and finishing them off with a grinder or a file, one way or another anyway. So, I'm just gonna keep thinning these down a little bit. I'm getting close to where I'm okay with them the way they are. I think I'd like them a little thinner back in the main body of the tine themselves, which is why I've been focusing more heavily there than on the tips. I'm going to sharpen these with file and sandpaper after I finish this up anyway. All right, we're looking pretty uniform. You're never gonna get it absolutely perfect unless you're doing a lot of these all the time and have a lot of practice on them. This has gotten to where I'm pretty happy with where it's at. Now the next step is going to be taking it to the horn of the anvil and bending the tines into alignment for the actual fork shape itself. And then we'll work on finishing things up on the fork, and we'll be ready to move back to the handle. All right, so this is going to be how I leave it, but it is slightly, with the perspective, you're probably not gonna be able to see it, but it is slightly twisted from the handle. So I'm going to heat all of this up and make sure that everything's in alignment. Then I'm going to clean up the shank and figure out what I want to do with the handle before we finish this up. All right, so after a lot of grinding, filing, hand sanding, and doing a lot of touch-ups, this is what I've come down to. Now, I opted to just grind and sand the entire shank and fork. I do intend to leave the handle covered in forge scale, however, it's looking a little dull. And I'm thinking a nice twist to the handle is going to make this complete. I'm going to fire the forge back up, knock down these corners with the hammer, and then do a nice simple full rotation twist on the handle, and then touch mark, and we'll be done. Alrighty, the last thing I'm going to do before I twist this handle is I'm going to give these tines a little bit of shape by bringing them both to the horn of the anvil and just bending them slightly upwards so that when you're using it, it's got a little bit of a curve like a normal fork does. Looks good to me. quick look at straightness on the shank. Shank ended up bending just because it was so thin. And I honestly have half of mine. I kind of like it the way it is. Just gonna reshape on the fly here, because it gives it a little bit more definition, a little more character, if you will, the way it accidentally turned out, which I find pretty cool. But I want to make sure it's in line, at least for the most part. I'm going to give it a brush, and then I'm going to touch mark, and then give it a final coating of beeswax. Touch mark turned out excellent. Give it another brushing, and then I'll make sure I hold it by the end down here, or not by the little shank, because it is still hot enough. Still wants to move. And we are going to finish this off with a bit of wax. That's gonna be way too hot. Okay, we're gonna start down here. Handle's still got a lot of heat in it. I'm gonna go ahead and clamp this in the vise, and then I'll let it cool down just a tad before I finish this out. Got a ton of wax on my vise jaws now. It'll melt off and burn off eventually. And that's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, or ring that notification bell. If you want to support me in the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video. Or consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel. And as always, keep on rocking.